Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on basic sociology. Friends, today we are going to talk on mass media, a social institution. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Dear friends, Professor Maitri Chaudhary is a renowned professor of sociology and she is teaching in Center for Study of Social System, and it is the important wing of JNU. Dear friends, we always get in-depth knowledge through Professor Maitri Chaudhary on various topics and issues, and we believe that today also you are going to get in-depth knowledge. If you have any questions or queries regarding the topic that is mass media, a social institution, then you can call us through our toll-free number and ask questions. Our toll-free number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now I would like to welcome our guest Professor Maitri Chaudhary once again and would request her to give us in-depth knowledge on the topic. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lectures.
The topic that I'm going to speak on today is mass media and mass media as a social institution. I will discuss why I'm going to focus on mass media as a social institution, being very central to the discipline of sociology, whose object of inquiry is to understand the social. I will begin again on a similar line. In my last lectures, I had begun on the distinction between common sense knowledge and theoretical knowledge, and I would like to begin on a similar note: media, everyday life, our common sense perception. For the younger generation, the media is part of our everyday life. It is natural, it is taken for granted. Whether in big metropolitan cities or small towns, or in the rural world, life without a mobile phone, television, radio is difficult to imagine. Young adults often ask their parents how they lived in the old days when there was no television. Recent developments, however, have made even television appear like old technology. Imagine the lives of young people and how you would live your life without the mobile phone, without Facebook, without WhatsApp. How would you get up without putting the alarm on your mobile phone? How would you see films? So if you sort of pay a little bit of attention, you will understand how much the media has reconstituted the social within which we live. It has reconstituted our cultural ways. It has reconstituted our leisure, our work time, our sense of aesthetics, our idea of recreation, and our idea of being up to it in a certain sense of the term, with developments which are around the globe. In a very fundamental sense, the media is right inside, in our lives, in our kitchens, in our homes, in every sphere of our life. For you, therefore, many of you who are young, this seems natural. And the manner in which the media would generally be discussed in the Indian context, maybe among the educated middle class, is that there was a time, this is when I'm discussing the common sense perception of media, there was a time when whatever was printed in newspapers or told on television was seen as proven facts. This was because a great deal of hard work and investigation went into verification of facts. Today there is cynicism about media. Today we often talk, even inside the media, of perception battles and not about investigated and cross-checked reportage. This is the kind of discussion, what we would say common sense discussion, that we would be having in our drawing rooms, in our conversations every day, that can we believe the media or can we not believe the media. The way the media operates has fundamentally changed. Earlier you would have great emphasis on field reportage and investigative journalism, and great effort would be there to cross-check and verify that a particular incident and the sequence of incident that is being reported is factually correct. Today we have less of investigative journalism, and what we often have is perhaps even a WhatsApp message or a WhatsApp visual being circulating as part of reportage in prime time newspapers or news media on television. Even within the media, people don't talk about verifications or to find out whether a particular news is correct or wrong. They will say it's a matter of perception, it's a perception battle. But perception, as we know, in sociology, in early discussions on classical sociological thinkers, is itself a very ambiguous term. Perception, what do we perceive? There is nothing given or an absolute in what we perceive. Let's go back in this section on common sense perception of media and recall our discussion on classical sociological thinkers and the example that I shared with you about an incident of firing. That there is a firing maybe in mob violence or in a particular incident, and you will have different contending versions or perceptions. Those of us, for instance, who are educated and better off, often believe that what we know are the best, and we will believe a media story that confirms our natural taken for granted beliefs. Let me give you an example to make this point a little clearer, because this point is extremely important in contemporary media. For example, if I as a middle class woman believe, as everyone in my family and larger world believe, that the poor are likely to be dishonest, likely to steal, we will believe a media story that confirms this. Or if we belong to a particular community and we believe that members of another community or the other community are necessarily violent, we will agree with the media story that paints the other community as violent and our own community as a victim. The story could be complicated. The story could be much more, maybe not related to a question of community at all, but maybe about big business fighting over land and using community identities to fuel or trouble community discord. So common sense perception of media often, unfortunately in the contemporary time, often becomes affirmation of a view or a perception that I already hold. Whereas the role of the media as visualized in democratic theory or critical theory would be that information which would shake up our taken for granted perception, which would make us aware, make us realize that the truth is far more complicated. It's not about a victim or somebody being a persecutor and you always agreeing depending upon which group you belong to. In fact, in a world where the academia and the media do not make a distinction between perception and verified fact or research fact, we start living in very dangerous times, going back to a pre-modern times where only our identity would decide what kind of belief systems which we have. Going back to the classical sociological times, we know that modernity, in fact, raised the idea of a scientific temperament, an idea which would critique or investigate and challenge the taken for granted. Why is sociology of media so important, and why do I begin with this emphasis on common sense perception and the need for a sociology of media to be more than an affirmation of what I already believe? It should be, in fact, a revelation, a question, a critique, the possibility of an enriched public discourse. What I'm trying to put forward in this particular slide is that in these examples, the examples I gave you of firing, communal flares, our personal location in society decides our views. A sociology of media, like a sociology of any phenomena, would be wary of this and ask questions that do not appear as obvious. For example, it would ask questions like, how do we understand media as a social institution? How did media emerge in contemporary times? What is the relationship between media and modernity? What is the difference between public media and privatized media? How do we understand the relationship between media and democracy, media and academia? These questions are informed social science questions. These are not common sense questions which will only ask, my view is the correct view, your view is the wrong view. In that context, we cannot have a dialogue. Now, if I am trying to argue that media is a social institution, we need to ask, what is a social institution? Within sociology in particular, a sociology influenced deeply by structural functionalism, the term institution usually indicates a system of beliefs, norms, values, positions and activities that develop around a basic societal need, or general institution are a pattern of norms that define behavior in social relationship. Habitualized human action set the stage for the development of institutions. Institutions, in other words, are very often defined as predefined patterns of conduct established by the habitualized human action. For example, we can see what we mean by this when we look at concrete examples of social institution: family, religion, school, polity, economy. I want to spend 2 or 3 minutes on what this understanding or definition of social institutions mean. When we say that institution is a system of beliefs, norms and values that develop because there are certain primary societal needs, and institutions respond to those needs and in a certain sense fulfill those needs, and in that practice a particular kind of behavior and particular norms get repeatedly practiced, and in this repetition they become institutionalized, we have the birth of institutions. I personally am a little uncomfortable with this definition because the birth of social institutions do not automatically emerge as a response to societal needs. They respond, in fact, in the dynamic engagement between human beings as social actors and their action on nature and culture in order to provide themselves the basic needs, which could be food, clothing, shelter. In simple societies, those needs are minimal, and institutions are also far more simpler. In complex society, the needs are more developed. You have multiple needs which encourage other forms of needs. You have institutions which over the history have become far more complex and complicated, and very often we do not even recognize the relationship between those early needs and those in the response of institutions. So, for example, if I talk about the hospitality institution or the hospitality industry as it exists today, very often it would be responding to needs which themselves have been created historically by talking about, we had a whole discussion on consumption, consumer society in our section on critical theories. You will realize that social institutions therefore cannot be just understood as repetitive behavior or institutional norms without locating them in the social context and the political economy and the historicity of different societies at different periods of time. In that context, social institutions understood from a Marxist perspective may offer us a certain dynamic understanding of social institutions. Social institutions emerge historically. That is, the social institution of education which exists today is not the social institution which exists maybe at an ancient Indian time, or maybe in a simple society of not such ancient times also. social institutions have to be linked to broader questions of what is society like at that particular point of time. I use the word social formations. That is, what kind of goods do people produce? How do they produce it? Thus, in a self-subsistence economy where there is no surplus is produced, the nature of institutions would be very, very different. Think about a subsistence economy. Think about going back even further, a hunting economy, where maybe a family would be very different. Maybe woman and man and children would hunt together. Maybe they would collect foods and berry in a collecting economy together. That is, it's very unlikely that in such a society of subsistence or collective economy, you would have what we understand an extended joint family. You would most likely have small mobile nuclear family, if that term could be used at a time when the word nuclear wasn't there, but they would be very small. But think about an extended family which we associate with the Indian joint family would perhaps exist only in a society where there is settled cultivation, land ownership, and you would usually belong to those sections of society who own land, and not those societies or sections of society who do not own land. Think about all the examples of extended family in contemporary India. They would most likely belong in the urban areas to business families who have a common source of earning, what they produce and how they produce, or they would belong increasingly less to extended families who are owners of land in rural areas. Likewise, just like the family is a social institution, would vary different historical situations, different political economy, culture, polity, communication would also vary across history and across societies. So the polity in a very simple society may not have the kind of complex state formation which we witness in a modern society. So for example, in this very classical text of anthropology, we talk about stateless societies where you have simple economies, simple polities, the possibilities of maybe kinship and clan, maybe chiefs who would negotiate balance of power and harmony within a particular society. But think of the modern state, extremely complex, extremely variegated and interventionist in the lives of people. Likewise, communication in the olden areas, in the olden period, would be very, very simple. Maybe you know about the past when you talked about the king or the monarch who has to make an announcement, and the people go out and beat drums, and you have a person who goes out talking about announcing the policies of the king. This was true of the Europe. This was true in our countries. This would be true of Africa or Latin America, that the communication in a pre-modern period would be very, very different, whereas communication and media in the contemporary period would be very, very different. The historicity of a Marxist perspective of looking at social formations and media would be very different, therefore, and it would draw attention to the interconnections between the different parts of society. A structural functionalist perspective, likewise, would also emphasize the interconnection between different parts, but would often explain a particular institution by the function they play for the sustenance of society. But when you explain an institution by the function they play, it can be accused of a teleological explanation. You don't understand how did it come to be. How did it come to be? We understand that the role, the function of this particular institution is this, but we have to understand and go beyond and ask, but how did this institution emerge? And then we can talk about the function of an institution. Drawing from both perspectives is in a certain sense very productive, because in both systems there's a great emphasis on norms. and goals and culture in the manner in which institutions emerge. Where they differ is that the functionalist perspective would emphasize the consensual nature of these norms, that everybody is agreed upon and that is how a society functions. Partly right, but partly false, because it's also true that very often these norms are not consensual. These norms are the norms of the ruling sections of society, but because the ruling sections have power and hegemony and an ability to both coerce and to make people consent, it becomes the general view of people. Media and ruling sections in society. Marxist analysis emphasized that unequal access and control to resources would also imply unequal control and access to media. Media would thus reflect dominant interests, yet media would open up spaces for critique. Understanding this dialectical relationship between media and society is very important. So on one hand, it is true that the ordinary citizen, the armed person, the aam aadmi, the aam aurat, so to say, do not have the same access to the media as the more privileged sections would be. Maybe ministers, maybe political party spokespeople, maybe celebrities, maybe Bollywood stars would have a different kind of access to the media. But it does not mean that the media is entirely controlled by them. Media, in a certain sense, also offers certain spaces that you and me today share as I speak to you on media itself, run by the government or public institutions, where I can use the modern technology of media to communicate to people across the country and perhaps even outside about a particular issue. This double-edged nature of media is extremely important to grasp both its coercive as well as its emancipatory possibility, both coercive as well as its emancipatory possibilities. What do I mean here then? We discuss social institution. What do I mean by media becoming increasingly a social institution that plays the functions of other social institutions too? Media as a social institution. Mass media have emerged as a social institution, assuming many of the functions formerly served by traditional social institutions such as religion, school, government and family. Young people like you would understand this immediately. You have a certain doubt, maybe about a particular recipe, maybe a particular ritual, maybe a particular cultural practice, maybe a particular scientific term, maybe about the Constitution. What do? You just Google. You Google and the information is there, right there on your lap, so to say, as you look at your laptop. Young people are socialized by mass media in a fundamental sense. In earlier times, how did we learn how to dress? We looked as young women, we would have looked at older women in the families. As young men, you would look at older men in the families, and you basically dressed up in the manner that they dressed up. If you read novels of a period of maybe 19th century Indian novels, you will find that young people would want to dress up maybe like the person who is considered very smart and important in the village. Maybe you want to dress up like somebody in the college in your city who is supposed to be known. But those are face-to-face interaction. That is, you don't learn fashion or how to dress through the media, which today may become very, very natural. So many of the traditional functions of social institutions have increasingly been taken over by the mass media. Now, when we talk about media and modernity and communication, does it mean that in the past, traditionally, we did not have traditional media? Traditional media. Ranajit Guha, in his 2009 seminal work on the social history of communications in India, demonstrates the existence of various non-written forms of dense communication networks like darks, native runners, traders, pilgrims, wedding parties, soldiers, wandering ascetics and artists, prior to the arrival of East India Company. Due to these extensive social networks, news would move quickly from one part of the country to the others. The then Indian rulers discouraged the use of print, fearing it could erode their legitimacy. Let us look at this slide a little more carefully to get a sense of what was being said. Firstly, I'd invite you to look at a wonderful poem on the native runner, the Darks, and maybe at some other point of time you could look at the net and discover the story of these native runners who had to literally run kilometers, miles in order to communicate the message from one place to the other. This kind of communication and media did exist traditionally, but it is not the same as what we understand as mass media in contemporary times, which is understood as the fourth pillar of democracy. So mass media understood in the contemporary time has a very different connotation from the idea of media and communication in traditional times. This is a point I will be coming to shortly after a break. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on mass media, a social institution. Friends, there is not more for you. You are just requested to be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on mass media, a social institution, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Professor Maitri Chaudhary. Professor Maitri Chaudhary is a renowned professor of sociology, and through her we always get topics, we get knowledge on the different topics and issues, and we believe that you are always benefited through her talks. Friends, if you really want to ask questions on today's topic, then do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Friends, you are requested to ask questions relevant to the topic, as well as you can ask questions in the last 10 minutes, so that first you could learn more about the topic, and yes, of course, in the last 10 minutes we promise to give answers to your questions. Now I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Maitri Chaudhary, once again. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
We stopped at that point when we were discussing the specificity of mass media in modernity. So the mass media and the idea of public good, I would like to sort of dwell a little bit on this because it's important to understand the close relationship between modern media and democracy. Perhaps it may not be out of order to go back a little. Right at the beginning, when I started the lectures on sociological theory, when we talked about the emergence of sociology, and we talked, if you recall, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the Enlightenment. And I've repeated it very often. The Enlightenment was the idea of critique, the idea of query, the idea of science, the idea for not taking anything for granted, but to investigate in particular modes and procedures. The French Revolution was an awakening of democratic principles, the assertions against monarchy, the assertions against ascribed identities, the question of the right of every citizen as an equal citizen to participate in the political matters of society. And the third, industrial capitalism, which sort of emerged with new technological and scientific inventions, and the logic of a capitalist world which was constantly seeking to increase its profitability and therefore expanded across the world, including colonizing many parts, including us, and therefore our entry to modernity is colonially mediated, which, as I mentioned earlier, brought forth certain kind of fundamental tensions and ambivalences. That is, we felt great resistance towards the colonial rulers, a certain kind of innate suspicion of the West, and at the same time we were inspired by the West and wanted to be like the West. This ambivalence played out in different contexts. The story of the media, you will also see the manner in which it developed in India, reflects in a certain sense that ambivalence. But first I want to go back to the point I'm trying to argue, that you have to understand the modern media as a product of certain innovations, technological innovations, certain scientific discoveries, certain links with capitalist growth and development and investment and entrepreneurship, as well as certain fundamental links with democratic theory and the idea of public good and the idea of a public sphere where the citizens could debate, discuss, contest and respond to state policies. Mass media and the idea of public good. You will recall our earlier discussions on liberal theory and democracy. Liberal theory for long understood mass media as a fourth pillar of democracy, a check on the power of the executive, legislature and judiciary. However, while critical theorists, there's a spelling error in theorists, saw an essential conflict between private control of media and the idea of public good. And questions were raised about the role played by the mass media and political participation, in particular in the relationship between the laity and established power. Very quickly, what is being argued here, that there was a certain debate or tension. On one hand, you had a liberal democratic theory which saw the media as a fourth pillar of democracy. What were the other three pillars? You have the executive, the government, which decides policies and executes them. You have the legislature in our country, the parliament and the state assembly, where laws are passed. And you have the judiciary, which takes into account any kind of conflict and decides what ought to be judged according to the provisions of the Constitution and Indian law. Now, the media was seen as something which was autonomous or separate from the executive, from the legislature and from the judiciary, and would be seen as something which would enable a critique and therefore would be a check on the balance. Therefore, if the executive was repressive, was perhaps exclusive, was perhaps encouraging certain kind of attack on citizens of the people, the media would take it up. Likewise, if you had a situation where the big business was perhaps being exploitative, the media would take it up. So the idea of the media as a fourth pillar of democracy is very central to a textbook understanding of liberal theory. However, right from the beginning, at the inception of the media and the growth of capitalism, critical theorists realized that there was a tension between private control of media and the idea of public good. In other words, if you have private ownership of media, they would be interested in maximization of profit. Their entire interest in contemporary language would be TRP. What works better? What is more popular? Which show do more people see? How many hits? It is basically driven by profit. Whereas the idea of public good very often is not driven by the idea of profit. Very often the idea of public good assumes that the state has a particular role, state broadcasting associations, and that is for the understanding of betterment of society as a whole. However, when you have private ownership, the tension between private needs for profit accumulation and the idea of public good would be in a contested relationship. Therefore, in media theory, these questions have been repeatedly raised, that what is the role of mass media in political participation? What is the relationship between the ordinary person and established power? And in contemporary times, this has acquired a different kind of urgency. Though the debate has been much older, and it's probably important to sum it up very quickly. There's a long-running debate in media theory over the ways in which the media not only disseminates elite critical opinion, but also influences the formation, expression, consumption of mass public opinion. How far do the mass media provide a public sphere in which citizens may debate issues in a democratic forum, and which those in power may be held accountable to the public? Look at the way we have our news media operating today in television. You have live television, and you may have a debate for the day, and you have live polling, and you can almost decide, depending upon the news channel, which side the voting would be and which theme would be put forward to media. That is not the way the media as the fourth pillar of democracy was envisioned. The media was supposed to inform us, just like the academia is supposed to inform people and pave way for a critical, deliberative public discourse. Likewise, the media was supposed to inform people. Supposing you assumed that a particular incident has happened somewhere else, the media was supposed to enlighten us, enlighten like the Enlightenment, tell us that look, the actual fact is this, what you believe is not true. Unfortunately, today you have a very different kind of trend where you may actually have a WhatsApp fake news being the basis of prime time television news. It could be the basis of even what teachers are teaching. It becomes for you the next generation upon whom this nation and country would rest to become critical, for a minute to step back from your particular identity or location and think about what public good would be equally good for you and good for somebody else from quite another class or community. Are there certain notions of public good? I can actually think of a certain notion of a public good, the idea of education for peace. That can we have an education which promotes peace and which talks about the terribleness of wars, of warmongering, of people who have died in war, young men, young women who've lost in battles, and their mothers' cry for those lost children would be the same irrespective of which country they fought for. So can we have peace as a public good? Peace as a public good which would be shared by members of all communities. Can the media promote peace? Would that be a public good? Think about it and you may come across very, very interesting questions. Maybe you can Google and find out about the pacifist movement in the West after the terrible tragedies of World War II, when people realized that, look, it is not a great idea to kill other people and get killed in turn if there is an alternative, Now here, when we talk about that tension between private profit making and the idea of public good, I want to draw your attention to Habermas, a thinker which we have discussed in our earlier lectures. Recall critical theory and Habermas. Habermas's position contains within it an ideal of public communication. He argues that if unfettered by institutional control, this ideal public communication might generate the critical consensus which he considers necessary for public participation in democratic political processes. Can the media potentially provide sites for public participation, expert accountability, integration of expert and lay knowledge, and the provision of ideal communicative situation? In other words, if Habermas would argue the media is let be by the state, let be by the market, let be unfettered by institutional control, self-regulated, create a condition where people participate, not participate by shouting and screaming and giving various kinds of accusations to the other, but public participation which is informed. For example, if you have a debate on water pollution or air pollution and you call experts like scientists, expert accountability, you bring their information, you bring in lay knowledge, maybe people, we had ideas of water harvesting even in the past, in history, in our own villages, we had ideas of how we can, what we call intangible heritage, about maybe questions of how do we look after little babies, about nutrition, about diets. You may have heard about the movement for seeds, preservation of seeds. As you know, very often we have lost our indigenous skills, diversity of crop production. If we have discussions on these themes, then perhaps we are promoting what is the idea of public good. But if, on the other hand, if we have a situation where the public good recedes and profitability becomes the prime criteria for which show is most popular, then we have a threat to democracy, a threat which undermines this. Let us go and explore this question a little more and ask, can private media function as a social institution? If we go back to the structural functionalist understanding of social institution and for a moment believe that social institutions are for the betterment of society, a harmonious functioning of society, and then can we restate this question and ask, can private media function as a social institution? In most countries today which operate on the private ownership model, media systems were never intended to serve as a social institution. The primary objective of a privately owned media organization is to make a profit for the company. Thus, many films, television programs, and websites contain sexual and violent content designed to attract the largest imaginable audience. The messages contained in these programs can be confusing and disruptive, and the public may be looking to the media for direction, purpose, meaning. Within this context, media literacy provides strategies that enable people to critically examine media messages and put media programming into meaningful perspective. I would really emphasize media literacy, that you as young educated people should know what is fake and what is not fake news. Media literacy will help you to ask questions like, who owns this television channel? Media literacy will help you to understand, could this be a morphed image or not a morphed image? Media literacy will help you to understand the implications of a fake WhatsApp. In our country, unfortunately, we know that WhatsApp messages have even instigated riots among different communities who may have lived quite harmoniously forever side by side. In that case, is media functioning as a social institution meant for integration or not? This is a question that you must look at. I would like to very quickly focus on Indian media, which, as you know, has undergone dramatic developments in contemporary period. In the early years after independence, we had state control, and we had media for development and an inclusive society, and we had state censorship. What do I mean by it? State control. When India became independent in 1947, the media was visualized as something which would be the fourth agent, so to say, for a development and inclusive society. That the media would transmit knowledge maybe about nutrition, maybe about agriculture. Remember, in the early years of television, even now you have television for the kisans, the idea of what would help crops grow, what kind of agricultural practices should be there. And we also had very unfortunate period between 75 and 77 when the national emergency was imposed, where we had straight censorship. More recently, we've had dramatic expansion of Indian media, print media, electronic media, social media. And what are the details? I'm not going to read it out. You can read it out in the slides yourself, but it is phenomenal. World over, print media is declining. In India, print media is increasing. And the good news is that many of the Indian language newspapers are doing even better than the English language newspapers. The bad news is that very often the Indian language newspapers are plagued by the same commercial imperatives of privately owned media as the English newspapers are. Sensational news, dramatic announcements, very few investigative journalism, but very many news information which tantalize, which make people curious and interested. In our country, from the 1990s, not only has print media dramatically increased, television has dramatically increased. You can just count the number of channels which are there and the amount of money which is expected to be growing. Their argument being that it could reach 975 billion by 2019. Again, I've put forward the data for you to look at because it would be interesting, because Indian media has really grown phenomenally. And I would also urge you to look at two texts on Indian media. One is Arvind Rajgopal, The Indian Public Sphere, Readings in Media History. Unfortunately, I've put a line which is in a certain sense erroneous, because I've written this will offer you an account of contemporary developments in Indian media. It is in other sense actually an account of historical developments in Indian media. The other is my own book, Refashioning India, Gender, Media and a Transformed Public Discourse, and this may help you to look at what are the new trends in Indian media and how that can impinge upon the functioning of democracy. There are certain observable trends in Indian media, and I would like to just flag them off. For example, infotainment, news as entertainment, over-communicative abundance, instant access, unequal knowledge, media agenda, new patterns of ownership, implications for democracy. Each of this I have discussed in detail in my book, which I had mentioned, Refashioning India, Gender, Media and a Transformed Public Discourse. But very briefly, what do I mean by infotainment? All of you would be probably familiar with that term. That is, they want information which is entertaining. So information which is also entertainment, not boring stuff, but chatpati stuff, fun stuff. News is entertainment, and perhaps is not no longer just entertainment, it is tamasha in the manner in which news is presented. So people are sort of fighting, shouting, screaming, and where is the news? Where is the public discourse? Where is the deliberative discussion? What do I mean by over-communicative abundance? A term I use extensively in my book, that there's too much. Very often you feel information is power, but what do you do when you have over communicative abundance? It's 24/7 breaking news. When is the time to assimilate, think, reflect and debate? What do I mean by instant access and unequal knowledge? That is, I can just press a particular button and I have information. But the information that is coming to me, I may not be ready for that particular kind of information. You have heard this terrible story of little children getting roped in by certain internet games leading to death. That is, they have unequal knowledge but instant access. This could be true for the violence, racial violence, community-based violence, caste violence, class violence, gender violence, where you have unequal knowledge. You really do not know what the event or the incident is. You do not have a historical perspective on it, but you have instant access. What do I mean by media agenda? Very often in media theory, you have the idea that media very often sets the agenda for discussion. It decides, for example, that today this is going to be the agenda. And now political parties and others have also joined in this particular game. So you put a particular information, maybe you don't want to report on floods or famines or maybe something which doesn't sound too good, and you decide to put forward maybe a scandal, a murder story, maybe a scam story, and you put it on news media, and once you put it on news media, it's there on television, 24/7 breaking, it's on your WhatsApp messages, it's on the Twitter, it's on the Facebook, it's over communicative abundance, and you do not even have an idea that this particular information could have been actually planted by active agents and institutions. It's important for you to look at new patterns of ownership, because very often you today have what is called convergence and multiple forms of ownership. Very often you would notice a new film emerges, a particular television channel interviews the stars of the new films in a particular program, and you have very complex cross ownership between different. So it could be products, you are in the cosmetic industry, you are in the steel industry, you are in the media industry, and this and you could probably also be a member of a political party or a leader of a political party. These cross convergences need to be understood and studied. Therefore, media literacy is important. If you do not have that knowledge, you will not know the implications which are there for democracy. You will not understand what it means to have maybe a little boring but informed discussion rather than the kind of shouting matches which has become the norm for media. But the irony is that these shouting matches are entertainment. You are bored, you put it on, it's fun. But the fact that this fun can have very, very grave implications for a just, inclusive, decent, civilized, democratic society is not being thought of. I want to very quickly make a distinction between old media and new media. Old mass media such as television, print media, books, magazines often involved what we call one-to-many communication based on a one-way process of producers creating information that is transmitted to large number of consumers. So I write an article in a magazine, and that magazine is read by thousands of people across the country and outside. So it's one to many, which was the kind of model which the old media had. What about the new media? The new media often involves many-to-many communication based on two-way communication with participants as both consumers and producers of information. New forms of mass media can involve two-way communication. For example, you all are young, you all may be watching web series on the internet, and maybe you can intervene to decide which way the story is going to move. Now, this gives an impression that the audience or the reader is really empowered, is really autonomy. It goes against an older media theory of cultural imperialism, where you talk about the media being hegemonic or, dominant and making you think in a particular way. The creation of autonomy in new media, however, needs to be looked at more carefully. That is it true that we are really creative audiences, or are we still influenced by the broader media agenda? Are our abilities to resist very limited? And let us discuss it, you discuss it among your friends and peers. And the other question I would like to flag off is, can we really distinguish old from new media? Today you have television news happening, below you have the Twitter and the Facebook simultaneously happening. You have print media, you watch it in the morning, you read it in the newspaper, but you can also look at it on your mobile telephone. So does the distinction between the old and the new media hold? 2 points I want you to look at, study, investigate. One is cross ownership, other is convergence of old and new media. Cross ownership and convergence of new and old media. I'd like to spend 2 minutes on understanding autonomy. What autonomy are we talking about? Are we talking about individual autonomy? That I want to look at this. I want to maybe look at a particular, program on television or a particular visual on the internet, which may be very, very bad for society as a whole, may be very detrimental to ideas of peaceful coexistence. So is individual autonomy pitted against social autonomy or autonomy of the larger public good, the point that I referred to before? Second, autonomy of the market. We talked about state censorship and we talked about emergency. There, the censorship is direct and therefore easier to see. But when the market censors and decides that, look, this is like the feeds you get, because maybe you are doing a particular kind of surfing, you get those feeds, the autonomy of the market is deeply compromised. And today the state and the market are working together in a much more sophisticated formation of market censorship. I would stop at this point of time, but I would encourage you, because we really are in a mediatized world today, that we do need autonomy, but not autonomy for just our personal pleasures, but for a free, deliberative media that enables the greatest public good. Thank you very much.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.cec@nic.in if you have any queries or if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture. The lecture is going to be uploaded on YouTube soon, so you can also comment on the comment box in YouTube, and we'll try to give answers to your questions by next time Professor Maitri Chaudhary visits our studio. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so very much.